Welcome to Face to Face, and today we're going to talk about war, we're going to talk about human being, we're going to talk about sociology, ontology. I'm with Professor Brian Ferguson. Thank you very much for being on Face to Face.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
And you're welcome. And so before, little bit, you want to give a little bit of context. How did you end up being studying wars? Because I don't think too many people are doing that work, or if they do, we don't hear very much. And how did you? Later on, we will cover your study.
Yeah, well, I was 18 in 1969, and Vietnam era, draft age, the anti-war movement. I was involved in the anti-war movement, and Vietnam was on everybody's mind. And I was against the war at that time, but I realized that I really didn't understand war. I didn't understand why it happened. And I went through college, and that was much about the Vietnam War during college. And when I went to graduate school, I chose anthropology. And I was told by one of my professors, one of those life-changing moments, that I didn't have to become an expert in some particular world area like the Caribbean, which is what I've been tending towards, what most people did then. But that you could focus on a topic. And the topic of war was very understudied in anthropology, in the history of anthropology, but there was quite a lot going on in the 1960s and 1970s, stimulated by
and being against war was very fashion. Yeah.
So that's how I got into it, and I've just stuck with it.
Okay, so just to give you a little bit of context of Pressenza, with a press agency focusing on peace and non-violence, we have been born in to promote a world peace on peace and non-violence in 2009, and really focusing of promoting the notion of peace and getting very famous people, very local organization promoving and going to cities and running that for 3 months over the world. So that's really when I saw your background and your article, then we published, we're going to cover later on. I was like, I need to speak with you. So,
great. And I'll just mention that I'm the director of a program in peace, a master's program in peace and conflict studies at Rutgers University in Newark. And we do have studies of war in that, but we also have studies of nonviolent movements and recovery from violence. So it's of great interest to us.
Okay, great. So let's start. So as you define it in the articles, you mentioned that war is not innate to humanity. So let's start. Can you explain a little bit from your emotional point of view, but more for like, how did you get to this conclusion?
Well, over at least a century, and probably far more than that, there have been many theories that attribute war to the outgrowth of some kind of inborn human tendency of various sorts. Like Sigmund Freud had his own theory of a death wish that impelled people to destroy themselves, and so they turned it instead on others, more productive that way. But there have been many theories, and in the 1960s, there were a number of very popular writers, particularly a man named Robert Ardrey, who wrote a book called African Genesis and the Territorial Imperative, which inspired a lot of other work. Inspired, for example, part of it inspired the film 2001: A Space Odyssey. The idea was that humans had somehow, in the film 2000: Space Odyssey, it was some kind of obelisk from outer space, but some humans had somehow an inborn tendency to destroy others of their kind. But that was a good thing, because that made us, free for progress. Well, that was 1960s and 1970s. It got knocked down, but with these theories, it's like whack-a-mole. If you knock down one, there's always another that comes up.
Another one who come up next.
Yeah. And sociobiology came up with similar theories, in evolutionary psychology and primate studies all have come up with variations on themes that humans have in basically it's not just simply something like men are aggressive, although that's part of a lot of these things. It's a more specific idea that there is something in people, or men at least, that makes them want to devalue and fear and hate people who are not in their own group, and if they can, to kill them. Because in the long span of evolution, killing off people who aren't in your own group was seen to be adaptive. It was, you get rid of the competition, so there's more food and mates for us. And so that idea became very popular in evolutionary psychology, which is a branch of psychology which roots itself in their own conception of evolutionary theory. I won't say evolutionary theory, because a lot of people who study evolutionary theory do not agree with that evolutionary theory, but they see it as evolutionary. And from that, they derive many other innate traits, like men being aggressive and women wanting to tie themselves to a man because the man's the protector, and lots of gender characteristics come along with that. So it expands to explain many things of human nature, and I think it's wrong. I think that the evidence shows, and the evidence comes in different sorts, and I've looked at most types of it. The evidence shows that people are certainly capable of war. Absolutely. There's no question about that. And of the most horrible forms of things.
We have information every day.
Inclined to it.
Yeah.
So that's it.
But do you see specific society who are more inclined to, because it was like at some point in your article, you have something about the simple society and the more complex one, and one producing, I mean, because it looked like it's a chain. When you start wars, after that you don't know, it might never end. I mean, it's like going. So I don't know.
Well, it is true, I think, that when you introduce war into a system, and people know that others out there are thinking of taking the option of war, it makes recourse to war much more likely. One of the questions I've had in looking at the archaeological record is whether there's any cases where we see evidence of war at some time in the distant past in some place, and then evidence of war go away, and then it come back. What you see is the archaeological evidence says no war, there's no signs of war. Then you see signs of war show up, and it pretty much sticks around.
Yeah.
And I think there are a few places where you might argue that war was eliminated for a period. The time around Stonehenge in England, there's a possibility that what had been earlier war was somehow pushed down, gotten rid of by some more elaborate peacekeeping system. But usually when it's there, it sticks around. And when you mention simple and hierarchical, human society we don't know what was going on 100,000 years ago. Our archaeological record is pretty poor past 10,000 years ago, although some places we have it.
Yeah.
What we tend to see in the archaeological record is that war is not found among simple, mobile, foraging people. That is, people who have a low population density, who move around a lot, who don't seem to have any indications of a political hierarchy. Then, in a lot of places, you find it's not agriculture yet, it's not domestication, they're still hunters and gatherers, but they're a different kind of hunter and gatherer, which is more settled, more higher population, more hierarchy, more bounding of the group. And sometimes, not all the time, but some of those without agriculture clearly have signs of war. Now, what I think is the essential connection is the development of leaders who are separate in terms of their own interests, in their own society, from people who aren't leaders. And leaders may be people who you may have in any situation, even up till today, leaders who are very committed to peace. But you also can have leaders who are very warlike. The essential thing is that once you have the development of hierarchy, generally speaking, war gives more concentrated power to leaders than non-war. There's kind of an organic connection between war and strengthening leadership. Now, of course, it can blow up and the leaders can get killed, unanticipated. But that essential connection that war leads to more, even in societies where a leader has no power at all over anybody else. When there's a war going on, oftentimes people will listen to that leader when he says, now we're going to build a palisade around the village, because their lives depend on it. Can't do it during peacetime, but can do it during wartime. So leaders, I sum this up in a phrase, and it's an oversimplification, but it's short, that leaders favor war because war favors leaders. There is an intrinsic connection between promoting war and promoting your own leadership ability, your own power.
Like a little bit like the crisis we have now, and then when the military get more favor than every other institution, like in the US.
Oh, yes. I mean, people don't pay any attention to how much the United States society has been restructured for war. I've got an article that your readers can Google. Just put in Brian Ferguson and 10 points on war. 10 points on war, and you get a PDF. And one of the points is leaders favor war because war favors leaders. Another is that war reshapes society to its own ends. That is, when you have war, often you have many structures of society, from belief systems to families to economy, that are reorganized to serve the purposes of war. And the United States is certainly that kind of country, and all of the industrialized countries. War has shaped the way our societies have developed for quite a long time.
So you work also on the tribe issue, and it was one of the definition of human being are tribal in some ways, and then you absolutely
I disagree with that entirely. I mean, it's a funny thing. See, anthropology had this down when I came into anthropology in the 1970s and 1980s. Anthropologists had looked at the concept of tribe and really broke it down and showed that it was in large part a result of contact with Western intrusion. I wrote a book or edited a book with Neil Whitehead called War in the Tribal Zone that came out in 1992, looking at war in relationship to expanding European contact. So I've been following it. And because I followed it, I noticed a few years ago that this word tribal, we're all tribal, we go back to our tribes, has just ballooned in the vernacular. Of course, it was used before, but before, very often I would heard someone say, we all have our silos. I don't hear silos so much anymore. We go to our tribes. And the idea is that it's somehow in our nature. And nothing I'm going to say here is going to affect people thinking that it's in our nature. But I can say it is not human nature to form bounded, antagonistic groups. Tribe today, if you look around the world where there are tribes, the word means very different things in different places. If you look at what tribe means in North America, among the first Earth people in North America, and in sub-Saharan Africa, the meaning of tribal has very different connotations. You go elsewhere. In Afghanistan, the United States Army became convinced that the key to fighting in Afghanistan was leveraging tribes, because everybody there is tribal. Tribes are,
and all the fight are because of the tribe.
Yeah, and so we could do that. But it's true that if you go into there's a word in their language that can translate as tribe, and if you ask someone there, what is your tribe, in that sense, they'll be able to tell you. But if you ask it in terms of another issue, another context, they'll also be able to tell you, but it'll be a different tribe. It's more encompassing, more narrow, more geographically different. The term tribe is highly variable. And when the U.S. tried to use it in Afghanistan, it really blew up in our faces. Yeah. It just did not work and caused a lot of bloodshed in one local area. What all the meanings of tribe have in common is that wherever you're looking in the world, take Australia, take South America, wherever you're looking, what counts as a tribe is something that developed in interaction with the expanding state systems of colonialism, going back sometimes centuries, sometimes more recently. But if you look at, so there are tribes out there, but if you look back at the earliest reports from explorers' contexts, like in North America, for example, which I was just looking at some things, what you see when the earliest reports that come out, the first trappers who were going into an area, or the first people who were going up the St. Lawrence River, or any of those, what you don't get is any sense of bounded groups, with a divide between them. What you get reports of is language difference, and often people speak multiple language, and also of place. Who's on the map here? The people who live at the village called whatever it is, or the people who live on the river that's called whatever it is. They're the people who live in that place without any sense that they can't move or that they're bounded. That's what people find. The first explorers found. And they would refer to them not often as tribes, they refer to them as nations. And it would be sort of a general foggy idea of language and locality, but it wasn't these bounded groups. What happens with European contact is two processes. One we call ethnogenesis, which is the creation of new, clearly defined, culturally similar people. And this comes as a result of two things mainly: populations being pushed off where they originally were, and populations being decimated by disease, and so they have to coalesce. So in the United States, for example, we think of the Seminole people. The Seminole people was just the name of a village where a lot of refugees from the European destruction coalesced, and it became known as a cultural group called the Seminole. The other thing that happens is tribalization, bringing us back to tribe. And the difference between tribe and ethnic, often they overlap completely, so you can't separate them often, is that tribe implies some kind of boundary, that there's some kind of political organization there of whatever sort, but some kind of political. Now, that happens because for two reasons. The European colonialists generally can't deal with what they find on the ground, which is everybody going their merry way and doing what they want to do without someone saying, okay, I can make an agreement for these people and they're going to follow it. The Europeans want somebody who can sign a treaty with them.
Yeah, they want control of it.
What's that?
They want control of the situation.
They want control. And for that, they need polity. They need a political structure.
Yeah.
The other thing that leads to it is more war, because the more fighting, my 0.7 in my 10 points on war is conflict creates the group. The group that's formed up is a result of the conflict. It's not the thing that starts the conflict. As it begins, eventually it can become the thing that starts a conflict, because then it becomes real. But how it gets real is my question. You look back deeper into archaeology. What does that say about war and human nature? Well, if you look back deeper into archaeology, and this goes back to the original question about war, the earliest archaeological records don't show signs of war. Now, far back, we can't say, we don't know enough to tell, but over time, what we see is war shows up in their records. And to me, that indicates that war has begun in those areas. Some people have said, well, just because you can't find the evidence doesn't mean it isn't there. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Okay? But against that,
to prove that it's very complicated to prove then you have peace if you what element you need, where war is much easier because you have weapons, you have a lot of things happening with wars.
Well, you prove wars there archaeologically with weapons, with skeletal remains that show deadly trauma, with settlements that are built for protection. But what people have said is, even if you don't find that, war is probably still there. This is a totally unscientific statement.
Yeah,
I don't have any evidence that it's there, but it's probably still there. If it's going to be there. But the key thing is that we have now more and more places around the world where we can see war start up in the archaeological record, where it's very clear that war has begun. And that can be 800 years ago in the American Southwest, or 5,000 years ago in the area around Jordan today, or it can be 13,000 years ago in some other places. So at different times, but you see it start up. Now, what I think, going back to the question of tribe, when you have war that leads to divisions between people, and either cultural difference or political bounding shows up. In the earliest archaeological records, all we have basically are stone tools, but those go at continental scale across North America, from Europe to Siberia, without any breaks in styles. It's the same style everywhere you go. So that indicates that they're not separate from each other. Later on, a few thousand years ago, we get much more archaeological record. What you start to get is clear-cut cultural differences. Here we've got this kind of pottery style. Over there's an entirely different kind of pottery style. That, some people have said, those are tribes. And sometimes they are. Sometimes they are. War has started in some areas, like in the ancient Jordan, about 3000 BC. It seems that war started, and then you started to get this tribal differentiation about 3200 BC. But sometimes it's just local interaction associations. It's not that there's a boundary between people, because if you go to the edges, you find intermediate styles. But that in some areas there's clusters of interaction. Okay, I've been talking a lot. So
now I want to, because we have very few minutes, and I want to talk with you about the notion of the future. It's a more peaceful world is possible. So how does it? So is an example of Europe and the process. So if you can give us an overview of how. Because I think that's a complicated image for people to imagine that the world could be more peaceful.
Right. It's how that could happen is difficult to say. Anthropologists have, for a long time, since Franz Boas 110 years ago, said if you look at the history of humanity, you find progressively larger societies with peace within. So war will decrease as societies become more inclusive. And others have said that since. Europe is something, and I wrote an article in 1988.
Yeah, in Scientific American.
No, not that one. There's another one's
okay.
called "How Can Anthropologists Promote Peace?" And in
Sorry.
1988,
Uh-huh.
I said one thing we could say is that whatever is going on now, we think whatever's going on now is it. That's where we are. That's where history is going to stay. In 1988, it was still the Cold War, and I said we can hold up to people the idea that, as implausible as it seems, sometime in the future there will not be a militarized boundary between East and West running through Europe, and it was gone the next year. It was impossible to conceive. So changes can happen.
Uh-huh.
Europe, the European community, would have been inconceivable 50 years ago. It doesn't mean it's always going to go one direction. Brexit shows that it can reverse.
Yeah.
South American nations, it's difficult to conceive of a war between the nations of South America, although it doesn't get as much attention.
Yeah.
So a lot of places have moved in that direction. Where I think my work suggests emphasis should be placed is on trying to understand and expose the internal benefits that leaders have in promoting a militaristic agenda. They may not even want war. They may just want to do a lot of saber rattling and look like they're ready for war, but that gets us closer to war. And I think if we looked at how it is that leaders in modern societies can reinforce their own position by naming some outside enemy and being prepared to or actually going after an attack, we can expose what's really going on in those situations, that it's not so much a conflict between the two groups. It's the individuals who are attempting to increase their own status within society. It's not going to make a world of difference, I don't think. But for an academic, you try and draw out what conclusions are there. And I think that looking at the interests of leaders, and the other thing is, in my approach to these things, leaders are never going to say to their people, do this because it benefits me. It's always do this for some transcendent moral reason or some kind of transcendent fear. They're going to kill us all.
Yeah.
That's what is always said. And so what you have to do when you're looking at leaders is to look at how they transform their interest into values that will appeal to the many people who they have to get revved up.
So, but just to understand, like you say, South America will be very complicated for South America to get some kind of conflict between them. Why that? Why it will be
South America? Well, I think that there's the situation. No, that's a great question. I mean, it wasn't a thing that was planned. It was once you got out of the Cold War, there wasn't anything that was really stirring people to war. There wasn't, the nation states were there. Basically, they didn't have a reason to go off and fight. One case where they did, we saw, was with Argentina and Britain during the fight over the, and so that was, and that was clearly to prop up the generals.
Yeah.
Why they wouldn't do that by attacking some other Latin American nation, I can't answer that. I don't know. But it's just when you look at the state of we look at the world today, there are certainly fewer wars going on right now than there were in 1992. That's when I edited a book about it. And the number of wars in sub-Saharan Africa were much more than now. And in the 1970s and 80s in Central America, there's a lot of violence in Central America today, and a lot of terrible violence against women, but it's mostly not war. And why is it not war in Central America? Because the superpowers got out of it.
Wow. So I'm going to thank you because we're running out of time. This is exactly
thank you.
What I really wanted to cover. I thank you so much for being on the show. That was your show Face to Face, and keep with watching your news on Pressenza.com, and hope to hear from you soon. And please subscribe to Facebook, YouTube, and share it with your friends. Thank you very much.
Thank you.